My name is Bridie with Heart of Heaven Craniosacral Therapy, and I am here today talking with Sheila Hoover. We're going to be sharing some memories, stories, and insights around the beautiful life and the craniosacral practice of my teacher and mentor, Wes Vaught, who Sheila had the great honor of knowing extremely well. So Sheila, I'm going to let you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your background and who you are and how your journey with craniosacral and with Wes also, how that wove together.
Yeah, great. And I appreciate you doing this because Wes was such a special soul. And I really like, it warms my heart to remember him. So I was married to Wes for 12 years. And I initially met him through craniosacral because I'm not a body worker, but I took an Upledger course just for personal growth. And then a friend of mine said, "Oh, you have to meet this teacher. He's amazing." And that's how I met Wes. And then I took his classes. And I knew him for a number of years before we got together. So my background is actually in e-learning, and I worked for the University of Minnesota. And I was working at the time at a center called the Center for Spirituality and Healing. And we were developing educational programming for people in the med school, dental school, pharmacy, because a lot of their patients were using alternative therapies and they had no background in them. So I would invite Wes whenever they had an interesting guest speaker. And so we always said that we met through field trips. And so, so I knew him for quite a while before we actually got together. And it was a very interesting passage being with Wes. I view it kind of as an apprenticeship because he taught me so much.
I totally believe that, having known him just in the way that I did as a student. And I think I mentioned this when we first met, Sheila, is that even decades later, if I ever run into others that were in that training here in Hawaii, the first thing we talk about is Wes. I mean, he impacted our whole lives, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And it went so far above and beyond just being a teaching in a particular modality that was incredibly rich. But he went so far beyond that, and who he was as a soul and as a person and as a being was so much bigger than going to a teacher for craniosacral therapy. That was my experience. And so I'm excited and I'm so grateful that you were open to sharing. I love that it gives you a chance to remember this incredibly special being that, as you said, you got to just walk with for all those years. And I don't recall you mentioning that you studied with him as well. What a joy.
Yeah, it was just great to spend time with him. I mean, I've been blessed to study with some amazing teachers. And like I said, it was interesting because I was never thinking of being a body worker, but what I learned from him in those courses was so much beyond that.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
And that's actually great for me to hear, because I'd love for us to bring in a little bit as well at whatever time of some of the things that you picked up on even being in class with him, because that was my relationship to Wes, was being a student. And he just had a style that was so uniquely Wes. I don't think you separate out the way he taught from the work itself and just from who he was as a personality and as a soul.
Yeah, it was interesting because when you first brought up this idea, we were talking about like what is it that made Wes unique?
Yeah.
And I spent some time thinking about that and what I might say today. And I think it's because I feel like his entire life was purpose to connection with the divine. Mm-hmm. And he spent his entire life in like intensive spiritual practice. And he apprenticed himself to master teachers and lived in intentional communities and monastic settings. And I think it's also how he was wired. It's just what his life was purposed to be. But at the same time, he did the really hard work of ego transcendence and radical self-understanding.
That is exactly, yes.
Yeah. And I felt like I would always describe him as like a spiritual authority, because when he walked in a room, I felt like it was infused with this kind of integrity. Like just because he was there, it was like, we are all going to treat each other with kindness and compassion. And he was really humble. Like if I ever said, I consider you a spiritual authority, he might cringe because he just didn't think of himself that way. And he didn't want to be put on any kind of a pedestal. But he was a really unique person. And I feel like he was a spiritual master in his own right.
It
Yeah.
certainly felt that way to be around him. And, I guess the obvious thing, perhaps because we're talking past tense and we didn't say this at the beginning, is that sadly for us, that Wes has transcended this world of Maya and duality at this time. And so we're sharing these stories and as a remembrance as well, and also to create sort of a small piece of a legacy of just like being able to bring memory to the beautiful soul that he was.
Yeah.
You're right, Sheila. It's like when I think I told you, it's like when I had the first phone call with him, which a friend of mine, Lauren, had given me his number and said, we've got this cranial teacher coming over. I'd already been asking the universe if there was any possible way that I could study craniosacral therapy on the Big Island in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. And within a matter of days, I saw the flyer in Honoka'a that Lauren had put up saying that Wes was going to be coming from Minnesota and that he would be teaching, this year long, or I think it became a year and a half long of study. And on that first phone call, Wes said hello and kind of introduced himself, and then he was silent. And I obviously didn't know him at all. And so I'm like, is he okay? There was just this big pause. And what I realized then was actually I started to feel his essence. And I started to feel his essence creating a container into which I was able to arrive. And it was almost like we met there in the silence, even before the phone call really became a conversation. And to me, that was very much how he taught.
Yeah, that's classic Wes. Yeah, he could hold silence, but it was so potent.
That's right.
It wasn't just being quiet. It was something else. A lot was going on.
It was rich. A lot was going on.
Yeah.
Actually far more than usually goes on in dialogue.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So do you want me to take you to the beginning?
I would love that. I would love that. I think you shared a couple of points when we first spoke about his childhood and just his journey of coming into healing.
Yeah.
That would be a beautiful, beautiful place.
Yeah. And I also have some notes that I can read, because when I was thinking about this, I was like, I would like to tell this as much as possible in Wes's words. Beautiful. And I tried to capture Wes to the best of my ability. Like I was always trying to record him, or I can type really fast. So I would ask him a question and then I would start typing. So I have a lot of material on Wes, but it was challenging because he was kind of camera shy. And so if he was with a group of people and you pressed his on button, he was amazing. But as soon as you hit record, I think, so anyway, I do have I have some quotes that I can read.
I would love. Yeah.
Yeah. So Wes always said that his first teacher was his grandma Della. And she was raised on a farm in rural coastal South Carolina. And her mother was Cherokee. And Wes said that Della taught him and his sister about healing presence and healing touch. And that made a huge impression on him. And so his father was also raised in this community where there was a community church, and they would do a ritual where they would wash each other's feet. And they would also do a form of laying on of hands. So he grew up in that kind of environment. And then when he was 14 years old, he started to be a trainer for his high school's football and track teams. And they actually sent him to this intensive training to learn how to set sprains and do sports massage.
Oh, wow.
So he did that all through high school. And then he studied with Roy Eugene Davis, who was a devotee of Yogananda. And so Roy Eugene Davis invited him to go to his yoga camp and to work there. So Wes went there, and then that's when his intensive spiritual study with different masters really was initiated. And he found his lifelong teacher shortly after that, and he moved to California. And he wore a lot of different hats. Wes was a master astrologer, and a lot of people didn't know that. And he had this mind where he could hear somebody's birth date, and I could see the wheels turning, and he could generate this whole astrological chart. But he never really wanted to be known for that. It was just another thing in his bag of tricks. And he was a plumber and a carpenter, and he did that just to make money while he was engaged in this intensive spiritual practice. And then he ended up, I think it was in 1990 that he got his massage certification at Harbin. And he then found Hugh Milne. And so that's where he learned craniosacral therapy.
Beautiful, beautiful. What a beautiful, from childhood onward. I mean, and actually even working with a sports team at 14 and getting trained in body work at that young age, and just being hands-on with so many people at a young age, and in the church as well.
Yeah. It's interesting that he then went on to do plumbing and carpentry. I mean, that served him well, but I think people at the time, people who knew him in that phase of his life, I think they thought of him as that, like, oh, he's a plumber and a carpenter. They weren't thinking, they didn't know what was beneath the surface.
Right. I remember him mentioning that he had done that, and I wondered how he transitioned from doing that sort of hands-on, sort of very, practical work to really diving into the body work. So
yeah. And the whole time he was doing that, he was apprenticed to his spiritual teacher, Adidas Samraj. And so that's what he was really doing all of those years. And that influenced the whole rest of his life.
Beautiful.
Yeah. So that was when I met him, was after he became a craniosacral teacher, which he did not intend to do that either, but his students started asking, or his clients started asking him, can you teach us?
Oh, I wondered how that came about, because my memory of Wes, and again, my knowing him was just during those years of studying with him, but he just seemed so humble. And I can't imagine him ever putting on the sort of teacher's hat as a role. So it makes sense to me that he was asked to please share.
Yes.
And especially because, again, my experience of his work, and so interesting that he came through Hugh Milne's training of that very visionary, which makes sense, especially for someone on a deep spiritual path, where that eternal inquiry is really the deepest part of the being for any of us who are really deep seekers. And so then to come through that visionary inroad into cranial work. But he just held such a very unique flavor in his work. And that's I think what I'm really curious about is, how did you perceive that? What was your experience of that? And what might Wes have said, if you have anything you want to share?
Well, I always said to Wes, you're the most brilliant person I have ever met in my entire life. And I know a lot of smart people. And he was like genius level. And I could have listened to him talk all day long. Like everything that came out of his mouth was fascinating and interesting and educational. And I asked him one time, I was like, how did you know that? What you just said, where did that come from? Because I don't know that you necessarily learned that in this particular lifetime, because what he would communicate just seemed beyond this realm. And then there was a time where he said that some of it was channeled, some of it he pulled in from past lives, but he didn't really talk in terms, he didn't really talk about his knowledge in that way. But I always got the sense when he was talking that it wasn't just a human body in this particular lifetime that was talking. He always seemed like some kind of a reincarnated llama or something, because I was just always amazed at the depth of his knowledge. Yeah.
I would say that that really resonates and rings true. I mean, he would bring things into the trainings that I did that I'm like, wow, this is someone who's really lived deeply. And you mentioned his sort of soul searching and his deep inner work, that transcendence of the ego and the egoic personality. Again, just came across so beautifully in his humility, but he would bring in references that were so rich. It was like watching a tapestry being woven out of ether almost. It was like he would pull things in that were subtle and weave it together with humor. I remember his
Yeah.
sense of humor tremendously.
So funny.
One of the funniest guys ever.
Yeah, I always felt like he is funnier than the funniest comedian. And he had sort of this persona that was very much like this Zen kind of a guy. And I think it surprised people when they realized how funny he actually was.
He really was, yeah.
Yeah. And so well read. I mean, he had studied every world religion, every spiritual tradition. It was really impressive.
Yeah, that's so beautiful.
Yeah.
It reminds me when there was a quote that when you talk about his humor, there's a quote about the Dalai Lama which says he could barely finish a sentence without bursting into laughter. And to me, Wes was kind of
Great.
like that. You know, he'd be teaching us about one of the bony structures of the body or whatever it was, or the attachment sites or whatever. And all of a sudden he'd just be reeling in laughter, and he'd have had some funny little thought that would come through that would get woven into, a sort of fairly structured anatomy and physiology part of our training, but we'd be, just collapsed in fits of laughter in the midst of it because he would just pull things out of the ether that were hilarious.
Yeah. Yeah. He was so funny.
Yeah.
And like I mentioned last time, I told Wes one of the reasons that he and I worked together was because he let me format him. Because he was, really into spiritual pursuits and not as much into the practical.
Yeah.
And so that's where I was very useful. I told his sister, I'm like, Wes and I get along because he lets me format him. And she was like, Wes needs to be formatted. So
Isn't it so beautiful? It's like sometimes people are so much in the astral or so much in the etheric part of their being, and having a partner who's so grounded and so capable, just it's like having a connection between those worlds that just, I would imagine, helps to ground.
yeah, I think it was mutually beneficial. Somehow it worked. Yeah.
Beautiful.
Yeah. One thing that I helped him format was after he had, been teaching craniosacral and seeing clients, I thought it just seemed like he needed a new challenge. And so I suggested that he look into getting a degree from the University of Minnesota. And he went to speak to the admissions counselor of this particular adult ed program. And he said to her, I would like a job where I get to love people, which is also so
That is so
Wes.
beautiful. That is so beautiful.
And she said, oh, you need to talk to this woman who was the head of the addictions studies program. So she brought him down the hall to meet this woman, Julie, and the two of them just hit it off. They had a total love fest. And he ended up getting a degree in that program. And then he was licensed as an addictions counselor, and he started working in that field. But it's interesting because throughout Wes's life, he was always a healer, but he was doing it kind of in different ways in his life.
Yeah.
And that job was actually really interesting because it was the first time he had, like an office job where he was doing counseling with clients, but he would go to the place, and on his first day he was roaring with laughter because they showed him his office, and he had never had an office before. And he saw there was a file cabinet in the office, and he was just tickled laughing that he actually had a file cabinet. And so there were 3 drawers, and he labeled the drawers this, that, and the other thing. And that was a perfect example of how Wes was. And whenever his clients would come in, he would start their sessions by having them sit quietly and meditate.
Yeah,
and that was really unique, but they loved it. And it was just really great to hear about the strategy for working with people.
Yeah,
and it was
that's
just beautiful.
I was going to say, that's so beautiful. Thank you for sharing that, because that's also how he started our classes.
Mm-hmm.
And like you said, when Wes would say, let's sit in silence, or actually sometimes he didn't say anything. And so we would just wind up sitting in silence because we were waiting for him to speak. And then we realized he wasn't waiting to speak at all. He was just being present.
Yeah.
And when Wes was being present with the group, there was so much going on. The atmosphere was alive. It was rich. It was tangible, and it was almost like he wouldn't. At least this was my perception looking back on it now. It's almost like he didn't begin teaching us until we'd all arrived in that group field together.
Yeah.
We'd sort of come in from driving and arriving and our sort of strategizing about how to get there on time, and we'd come in full of movement and perhaps full of thought. And Wes would just be there like a mountain. And you could see he had no intention of saying anything at all. So we would just fall into silence. And it was like eventually he was like, okay, we're all here together now.
Yeah.
And it was like the whole group was in session.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I always felt like people had an intuition that they were safe with Wes, because one of the things I learned from Wes, I mean, I've learned so much from him, but he was radically non-judgmental, because he could look at somebody and see what was like behind their act. And if everybody else is like, oh, this person is such a pain in the ass or something, Wes never went there, because he could see what they were suffering behind the facade. And so whenever there was somebody that other people thought was difficult, he would say to me, this is what, he could feel it is going on behind or underneath it all. And I learned, because he would always say, no matter what it looks like in any moment, everybody is doing the best that they can. Beautiful. In any moment. And he was such an example of that.
Yeah.
And I think so people could let their guard down because they felt like their tender feelings were safe with Wes, because he was not going to judge them, because he saw them and understood them and didn't judge them. He just had compassion for where anybody was at. And I think that's what made him a really effective healer, was because people instantly felt safe in his presence. Because he was so kind. He was so kind, and not like superficially like nice. He was so compassionate And he saw people and he just loved them. And people could feel that and respond to that. He talked a lot about therapeutic alliance. And I thought that he was a master at establishing a therapeutic alliance with people.
I love that. How would you put that into different words? I like that term, therapeutic alliance. How might you describe that in
I
relationship?
think it was just communicating to somebody that he was there for them, that he saw them, understood, and had their best interest at heart. And so I think when people feel that, they let their guards down.
Yes.
And sometimes that can take a while. But with Wes, I think he could do that with people pretty quickly.
Yeah, that makes sense to me as well. And it's interesting. I hadn't thought about that in relationship to him, particularly, although the compassion, yes, but I hadn't really thought about him in terms of safety per se. I just hadn't had that thought process. But I realize now that's why I was studying with him, because when I came into this work, I won't go into the story, but it became apparent to me in a way that was quite shocking, the importance of safety in this work, energetic safety, emotional safety, even physical safety. And I realized that the work was profound and that I wanted to study it and I wanted to be able to share it because it's so beautiful and it is so deeply healing. And I also knew that for myself, what was most important at the core of that was to bring absolute clarity and pristine intention into the work and absolute safety, not only at the physical, but also the mental, emotional, and at the subtle level. And so hearing you say that, it makes total sense to me. I'm like, oh, no wonder you were drawn to study with Wes, because he did. He held that space of just pure compassion, but also pure intention.
Yeah.
Yeah. Which is such a rare gift.
Yeah. I mean, it just, yeah, like I said, he did the work, he did the hard work, but it was also just who he was naturally. He was such a gentle soul. Yeah. Yeah. And it's also interesting to think of, like, how is a person like that made? Like what are the, because it's like how he's wired, his karma, but also his experiences, because one of the most profound experiences that he had was a near-death experience, or a death experience when he was a kid. And did he ever tell you about that, where he
I don't recall.
drowned?
He may have, but I don't recall that.
Yeah, he wrote about it, and I can read that. He said, as a child, I had a drowning accident in the ocean off the South Carolina coast. After staying under and breathing seawater for quite a while, my awareness drifted into a dazzling, bright light. It was entirely blissful, and I was happy and unafraid. My uncle saw my fingertips wash up out of the surf and managed to pull me out, now all but completely drowned. When I woke up later on the beach, my sense of reality had shifted. I didn't know how to say it in words, but I wanted to find a way to live in this light and touch others with it. As a persona, I could still be mean or petty, but this light was kind and beautiful. I was always drawn to touch as a primary means of communicating this light. And I also wanted to read, like I said, he wore so many different hats and he did healing in so many different modalities, but touch is where it was at for him. And he wrote about this too. He said, all the senses are marvelous or mysterious. Touch, sight, hearing, taste, smell are the five senses usually noted. A sixth sense is also posited by some, perhaps we could simply call the sixth sense an intuition of spirit, original consciousness, a sense of presence, light, or love. Each of the senses can be exalted or sublimed into this larger sense of existence. Something may therefore taste delicious, smell heavenly, sound divine, or appear beautiful. What is the most exalted sense of touch? We have perhaps heard voices say, "That feels wonderful, that is glorious, that is so good," or cozy, safe, warm, relaxing, or peaceful. There is also the dimension of touch, which deeply restores the being to health, well-being, spiritual wholeness, feeling loved, in love, or a sense of oneness with all existence. This is the sense of touch which has always fascinated me.
That's so beautiful.
Yeah, he was also a master writer.
I'm so glad that he put some things down on paper and that you also were able to capture. I hope at some point you might bring all of that together in some way. It's a real treasure.
Yeah, at some point I've thought about that. It would be quite a job.
I'm sure, right? I'm sure.
But yeah, it's always lovely to visit Wes's writings.
Yeah, and that just captures as well. And I was thinking earlier, there's different schools of cranial work, and they each have a slightly different flavor of approach, from the most structured schools to the more biodynamic, which is really beautiful and fluid and opening, and then to Milne's visionary style. And I don't know, I kind of think Wes falls into his own category, honestly.
Yeah, interesting.
But that's just my personal thought. But what you've shared, just like the way he would look at life and the insight, really was so much what he brought to the work.
Yeah.
And it was very much a spiritual experience, was my experience of receiving work with him, which I did during training. And I think I had a private at some point as well, just to experience the way that he worked with a client. And it really was like being on holy ground.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I feel really fortunate having been, married to him for all those years, that he worked on me quite a bit. And I got a lot of craniosacral work, and I was like, wow, that's some good karma that I have in this lifetime.
It is.
Yeah.
It really is. Does that resonate for you the way I've described that? Because you obviously received a lot of work for him. How would you describe his work?
Yeah, I think that his work went so deep. And, a lot of healers do deep work. And I think as Wes and I shared a spiritual practice, we also, saw things similarly. And I felt like his work was just an extension of spiritual practice.
Yes, I would say that's true.
And it wasn't like fluffy bunny. I mean, the work that he did was also a challenge, because even though he could see and have sympathy and compassion for what someone's act was or what their pattern was underneath a behavior, he also was a master at calling people to responsibility for what they were enacting. And he would do it with grace and tons of humor. We used to do considerations, is what they were called, with other couples or individuals. And Wes and I did those together, but mostly it was another way I was apprenticing because I was watching him. I was always amazed how people could go from being so upset and so attached to suffering something. And Wes would artfully and masterfully work with people and just get them laughing. And just, it was so amazing to watch that transformation. and just how he worked with people and could get them to this place where they were just laughing their asses off. It was like really brilliant.
That's so beautiful. That's so beautiful because I mean, realistically, there's a level which I know that this is a spiritual practitioner. There's a level of unreality to this reality, and when we can unhook from the sort of the more dense layer of our stories, then there's space there for expansion. There's space for transformation, and it's so much more graceful at that level. And it's so much easier at that level.
Mm-hmm.
When we're really locked into the pain or the story, which is, with compassion, very real for us at those moments. But it really is a beautiful art form to be able to help someone lift above that and become a witnessing presence to that, and then actually step into the magic or step into the sort of the realm of the divine in which that is also not totally real.
Yes, exactly.
To be able to transform it at that point.
Where the magic happens.
Is where the magic happens. Yeah. Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Another dimension of the work that Wes and I did together was death and dying work.
Oh, yes.
So Wes had done a lot of death and dying service in the 80s because he was living in San Francisco and had friends who passed from AIDS. And they did like the Buddhists do 3-day vigils at home. So he had to learn all the practical details of how you serve that and make it happen, and also the spiritual aspects of serving someone's transition. And I had no idea when I got together with Wes that this is where it would lead, because I was never somebody who was interested in hospice or had thought much about end of life. But just because of who Wes was and who I was, friends who were extremely ill or were dying would come to us. And so together, we ended up serving the transitions of several friends and relatives. And every single one of those is a story unto itself. Each passage was remarkable and shattering and beautiful. And I saw what happens at the end of life and what an amazing passage that is. And that's where everything gets real. I mean, you want to talk about real spiritual practice when people are at the end of life. It's so real. So that was another apprenticeship that I did with Wes, because I watched him in action and he was amazing and brilliant. And I realized that he was actually training me to serve his death. And he had a heart condition. And like I think we talked about, part of his greatest gift was how open he was. But it was also his greatest challenge, because then he was influenced by so much, like noise or energetic pollution, that I think it affected him because he couldn't turn it off. So we moved from Minnesota to California because his health was declining. And we lived there for 3 years to be near his son. And then Wes and I had many discussions about end of life, because he was 18 years older than me, and he had this health condition. So being the practical person that I am, I said, okay, now we need to talk about this. Like, how can I best serve you if you happen to pass before me? Because we didn't know for sure. And so I was asking him all these questions to sort out like practical details, because I wanted to make sure I did it right. And, there's no way you can answer all of the questions. So he said, no matter what happens, I'm okay. And that I could just feel that communication from him. And he said, no matter what happens, you can always find me in the light. So I had this fear because he had a heart issue that he could go at any moment. And that was actually true. And so I would worry, like he would go take a nap and I would be worried that he would die. And I was like, I can't live like this. It's too stressful. And he told me, and it's the same thing that he told parents and anybody else who was worried about something. He said, instead of collapsing in worry or concern, be proactive, have an active asana relative to whatever is happening and shine light into the situation. So you're being proactive and serving the situation by bringing light to it. So that was a major spiritual practice for me because I had no choice but to practice that whole passage with Wes, because the reality was he could go in any time, but was I going to live on the basis of worry and fear and concern, or was I going to shine light? And I couldn't always do it, but it was quite a lesson for me.
That's amazing. That's an amazingly deep.
Yeah.
Meet that.
Yeah. And I mean, I feel like that kind of characterizes the whole passage with Wes. It wasn't like what I had thought of like your typical relationship. It was, I must have signed up for some really deep instruction.
Yeah, it sounds like a spiritual path in itself.
Yeah. Yeah. So before Wes passed, this was like a few weeks before he died, maybe a month or so. He said this beautiful thing to me about when I die, and he went on from there. And I said, that was so beautiful. I said, can you write that down so that I always have it? So he wrote it down on a piece of paper and I tucked it away by my side of the bed. And I forgot about it. And it wasn't until a few days after he had passed that I found it. And he said, when I die, I want you to be joyful, to relax and recognize every moment of your awareness is the light of everything, your own living being, the beauty and ordinariness of all, and be grateful and happy, anchored and held by love. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. And then a friend of ours who was also a healer, he was a doctor of traditional Chinese medicine. After he found out about Wes's passing, he sent me this note, and I just thought it was really beautiful, and I'll read it to you. He said, Wes was such a good man. The nature of his passing shows us the possibility of different points of view that we can have about things. For although Wes may have had coronary health issues, I never knew a man with a better heart. He is a reminder to all of us that true health need not be equated with the absence of pathology, but rather can be viewed as the presence of something so much more precious, a good spirit filled with love and compassion. In this way, we can be healthy, even in the midst of sickness. We can flourish even in the face of our own mortality. Wes will always remind me of this.
Those two readings, Sheila, are just so precious, and I'm so honored that you share them because they're so personal as well, but they're also so universal.
Yeah.
I'm so grateful that you shared them, because I think, death and dying is one of the things that our Western culture shuns to some large degree. We have so little dialogue historically in Western culture about the process of death and dying, and certainly about making that a sacred passage. And I know that's starting to come in now, but it's coming in, and it's just sort of this fringe concept of
Yeah.
death doula, and actually creating a sacred transition.
Yeah.
And you've lived an incredible journey with that, and also with that in your closest primary relationship with Wes, to have such a depth of meeting with that.
Yeah. Yeah. And his passage completely changed me. I heard it said, the relationship is not over, it's been transformed.
Yeah.
And that's my experience of Wes. And
It's
also funny because I found these notes that Wes had written all over the house after he passed, just written on little scraps of paper, these really brilliant things. And one of them, I'll show you, I have pinned here. This piece of paper, and it says, visiting angels. And it was like he left me a note telling me where he was. Oh, I'm just visiting angels.
I've just popped out.
Yes.
But not gone it. Oh, so beautiful. What an amazing journey you have and have been on, that I wouldn't have known. So I'm so honored that you shared that, because it not only sheds light on Wes, but just on the nature of your relationship with him, and just your journey as a soul as well. And
yeah,
I'm also grateful for my journey with craniosacral with Wes, kind of bringing it full circle so that you and I get to meet. And I have a question, if it's okay to revisit. You talked about the serving of those ones that were going into transition that you and Wes did together as a couple. And you mentioned just how rich that was. And I'm just wondering, like, from being present, because most of us don't get to do that, to be present with a number of transitions, is there anything that came out of being present for those journeys that you could kind of say epitomized or gave you a new insight into death and dying? And we weren't going to talk about that, but I think it's
I
just
would say, yeah, the first thing that came to mind when you asked the question is that I think people have this idea that when you're dying, like if you've been on hospice or something, that it's the end of the line and you're just in the bed and you're just kind of passing time until your heart stops and your organs fail. But I noticed that it's actually one of the richest times for transformation. I've seen people resolve deep wounds on their deathbed. And it amazes me because, like I said, people don't think of it that way. They think, oh, you're just sliding out. Oh, but actually, the most remarkable transformations can occur at the end of life. And they can happen pretty quickly. Like it seems like there's an acceleration because people are, like we talked about before, that's where the shit gets real, is when you're faced with death. And it's just been amazing to see how people heal themselves and their families, their intimates, their loved ones. And it's a really beautiful thing.
That is such a beautiful gift to share that. Thank you.
Yeah.
I think, also makes my heart really full. It just feels like there's such a sense of hope, even for people that perhaps have been really stuck in some personal or interpersonal dynamic that, like you said, once it's real, it's down to the wire, there's no messing around. You've got so many heartbeats before closure.
Yeah.
And your life journey, and in that moment, just things really can be transformed.
Yeah, it's a really rich time.
That's really heartening. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
So beautiful.
Yeah. After Wes passed, I went on to become trained as an end-of-life death doula. But it was interesting because I felt like Wes had already trained me in. I mean, I did learn some things, but I was like, oh yeah, I did that. And then I didn't just learn it as an intellectual exercise, like I lived it and had all these different, real world experiences.
Beautiful.
So yeah, that was another gift of being with Wes. There were just so many. And the beautiful thing is, I never felt like I owned Wes. I just always felt really lucky that I got to spend any time with him. And he touched so many people, like you said, so many of his students and clients. He really touched their lives. Yeah. And I don't know that he realized the depth of his impact on people's lives. Because it was really profound.
That's so beautiful, and I can imagine that, just knowing how he touched our little circle. Like I said, I mean, I can't imagine having learned any other way, come into cranial work any other way, and I think the way that I work has been hugely blessed by having studied with Wes, just being in his presence as he guided us into the work and taught us how to hold space for the work. Mm-hmm. It really just felt like we came in to cranial in the most sacred way imaginable.
Yes.
To where every session really was, using a word that you've used, which I love, is serving the soul of the individual.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, he did everything as a spiritual practice. We used to go canoeing all the time, and he would make an offering to the river before we got on it. And he did everything as a prayer. Did he make those oatmeal cookies for your class? Did you get those?
I wish I could say I remembered. I don't recall, but that doesn't mean he didn't.
He was known for making oatmeal cookies.
Now that you mention, I mean, Laura would be the one to know because she was hosting with Lauren Hershkovitz, but I kind of feel like that probably happened. I seem to remember there was a lot of yummy food that happened, and there was a lot of dancing that happened, a lot of joy. Like we would wind up a day or a weekend, and he'd just put on this funky music, and we would he'd like, let's get down.
Yeah,
the whole class would just end up just in this sort of funky dance love fest with delicious food and just so much heart, and and lives had been changed during the course of those days every single time, my own included. And I can't imagine, honestly, I can't imagine any other way of coming into the work in a way that I would see what was possible at the level of the soul transformation.
Yeah.
So we were blessed. I feel blessed in my own tiny way of studying with him. I feel so blessed to witness and share a little piece of your journey with Wes. Mm-hmm. And I can see what a huge blessing that journey is in your life. And I know that you work for Wes. As you say, it's like every soul that walks between worlds needs an anchor, needs some way to connect in and to be held in the physical.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It's interesting who we connect with. And, like you were praying for a teacher, it's like when you do that, who shows up?
Right. Yes.
Yeah.
And it was interesting, just sort of an aside, but in my own journey, I had been guided to a spiritual, what should I say, spiritual mentor a few years before meeting Wes. And so, and he was Christ-like. I mean, he was just not of this world. He was just an amazing being who was kind enough to then tell me a year or so into knowing him that he wasn't my teacher, which was a huge gift. But I got to study with him and then came into studying cranial work with Wes. So it just felt like the combination of those two elements of having the spiritual mentor who really was from a different dimension, just even being in his presence. Our time together would begin. I would be driving down the Hamakua coast and I could already feel, that teacher working in my energy field. And then to have that coincide with studying cranial work with Wes was an amazing container to come into my journey as well as a cranial practitioner. So
Yeah.
nothing but love and joy and gratitude for all of it.
Yeah. It's beautiful. We're lucky.
I think, likewise, what an amazing journey, what an amazing blessing in your path, and what a big journey as well to go through this whole piece, including just being present with the transitioning of Wes and having served the other souls that you were with as a couple before that, to have that amazing container around the transition between realms, the transition from life to death, and the continuity, as you said, that the relationship doesn't end.
Yeah, there are no limits.
There are no limits.
Truly.
Yeah.
There are apparent limits.
Right. Oh, yeah, right.
Really. Right.
Oh.
Yeah.
Well, Sheila, this feels really full and so rich, and so I feel like, there's such a rich presence here with us, even just as we're sharing. And I so thank you for being willing to meet and to share, and just to share some of the beautiful writings that you brought.
I'm happy to. Thanks for the invitation.
Yeah, beautiful. So on my side, I didn't want there to be a time where there was nothing at all written or findable for people to just know Wes and just to touch the legacy, even just through hearing stories. Because I think he was such a unique soul, and also within our work in cranial, just such an amazing, just set the standard for such a deep level of soul practice.
Yeah.
Work. So thank you.
Yeah.